Dougal's Scottish holiday. It is decided. One morning Dougal woke up very slowly. First he opened one eye, then he opened the other. Then he closed the first eye and tried using just one. Then he closed the second eye and started all over again by opening both very wide and very suddenly. It was a terrible shock, so he closed them and went back to sleep. "Come into the garden, Maud, for the black-bat night has flown," sang a voice. It was Brian. "Come into the garden, Fred, for the black-bat night has fled." Dougal sat up with a start. "What?" he screeched. "What? What? What?" "Come into the garden, Ron, for the black-bat night has gone," sang Brian, going over to the stove and putting the kettle on. Dougal watched him from the bed coldly. "Have you gone out of your mind completely?" he said. "Good morning, good morning, good morning," shouted Brian. Dougal got out of bed and went very close to Brian. "You've come very close to me," said Brian nervously. Dougal looked at him very hard and then spoke very slowly and very quietly. "Mollusk," he said, "listen carefully. In the first place, you have woken me up. In the second place, you are making a great deal of noise. In the third place, it's the middle of the night, and in the fourth place, what are you doing in my place?" He paused. "Take your time and answer slowly." "I get the feeling you're displeased with me." Dougal made some tea. "Just answer the question." "Ah," said Brian, "you don't know, do you? No, of course you don't know. How could you? Silly of me, I'm a potty old thing. What must you think of me?" "Do you really want to know?" said Dougal. "Ha, ha!" laughed Brian again, just a little nervously. "Ha, ha, ha!" He took a sip of tea and a deep breath. "You're taking us all on holiday this winter," he said very quickly. Dougal dropped his cup on the floor. "You've dropped your cup, old mate." "What did you say?" "I said you've dropped your cup," said Brian. "Before that," said Dougal. "Before that? Now you're asking me to remember. Before that, what did I say?" "Yes, what?" "Oh, difficult to remember," said Brian. "Difficult to make the old brain tick over." "Force yourself." Was it about winter?" said Brian. "Yes," said Dougal. "And a holiday?" "Yes." "About winter and a holiday?" "Yes." Could it have been about you taking us all on a holiday this winter?" Dougal dropped his saucer. "You've dropped your saucer, old thing," said Brian. "I know," screeched Dougal. "I know. And he picked up the cup and saucer, dropped them again, kicked them across the room, and jumped onto a chair. "I know." "Well, that's all right then, if you know," said Brian. "Can I have another cup of tea?" Dougal sat down heavily. "Pour me one and tell me the worst." "Well," said Brian, "we thought it would be lovely to have a winter holiday this year, and as you're so good at organising things, we thought you would make all the arrangements and take us." "Who's we?" said Dougal. "Florence and me and Mr. Rusty and Mr. McHenry." "Anyone else?" "Dylan." "And?" "Ermintrude." Dougal groaned. "What have I done to deserve it?" Brian finished his tea. "Well, that's all settled then," he said. "I can leave the arrangements to you. All right?" "No, it's not all right," said Dougal. Where are you taking us?" "Give me time to think," said Dougal. "Please." "Of course," said Brian. "I'll get the others and we'll come back in, 10 minutes? Make it 3 days and not a minute sooner." "They're very impatient to start," said Brian. "Then tell them to start," said Dougal. "I shan't mind." "Without you, our leader, our friend and holiday arranger?" "Get out," said Dougal. "Any tea left?" said Brian. "Get out," said Dougal. And Brian got out. Dougal sat down and thought. He thought it was rotten of everyone to expect him to arrange their holidays. He thought that a holiday, however, might be rather nice, especially in the winter. Winter, he mused. Where can you go in the winter? It's so cold. He stopped. Snow. That's it. A holiday with snow. He rushed about. What a great notion. And the very place, Scotland. Plenty of snow. I'll take them to my Uncle Hamish in Glendougal and introduce them to the clan. With any luck, I might lose a lot of them in a drift. He chortled and ran round in a circle 9 times. Scotland the brave, he sang. Now, where are my skis and my haggis bag and my skates and the woolly cap my Auntie Meggsy knitted? He threw things out of drawers and hunted in cupboards. Scotland the brave, he sang. The winter holiday was decided. It is arranged. Dougal's room was crowded. Everyone was there, sitting wherever there was room. Florence, Brian, Mr. McHenry, Mr. Rusty, Dylan, and, half in, half out because of space problems, Ermyntrude. Now, are we all here? Said Dougal. He was wearing a tartan tammy and looked quite imposing. Is everyone assembled? More or less, dear thing, said Ermyntrude, and we are all agog, aren't we? Everyone agreed they were about as agog as they could get. Dougal took up an important position, adjusted his tammy, and told them his plan. They were to go to Scotland. Everyone would be accommodated with Dougal's Uncle Hamish, who had a large house. Everyone would assemble to leave, ready packed, in an hour's time. They all started to talk at once. How could they go to Scotland? How would they know what to wear? Silence! Shouted Dougal. There was silence. I don't know what all the fuss is about. I'm ready to leave. But you knew, they shrieked. All right. Just get ready as quickly as you can and we'll start. Right, said Florence. Everybody get ready. They all went to get ready. Don't be long, shouted Dougal. We won't, they shouted back. And they weren't. Much sooner than Dougal had expected, they were all back, loaded with luggage and expectation. Mr. McHenry was wearing an overcoat and a muffler and carrying a canvas bag marked Epton McHenry, Botanist. Mr. Rusty also had an overcoat and a muffler and was dragging a large trunk labelled SS Titanic, this side up. Dylan was carrying a guitar, a rucksack, and a large bunch of carrots. Florence had a brand-new ribbon in her hair and was carrying a school satchel marked Florence Top and Jog. Brian had a blue case marked Savoy Hotel Laundry and a large bag of lettuce. He dumped these on Dougal's doorstep. How do we get there, then? Dougal paled. What? He said faintly. Oh, sorry, have I asked an awkward question? Florence turned to Dougal. His tammy had slipped over his eyes, and he seemed to be having difficulty breathing. Are you all right, Dougal? Asked Florence, but before he could reply, there was a loud whistle, and a train arrived outside with a clank and a whoosh. You weren't thinking of leaving without me, were you? No, said Dougal. No, of course not. You're taking us all to Scotland on holiday, remember? Scotland holiday? Said the train. I never... But before she could say another word, Dougal started to bundle everyone in. Now, just a little moment, said the train. If I'm taking you all to Scotland, 1 or 2 requirements have to be met. There are certain rules for journeys, and I don't move a single puff without them. First, I shall need a guard. Me, said Mr. Rusty. "I've always wanted to be a guard, man and boy." The train whistled again. "I also need a ticket collector and a buffet attendant and a stoker and a chum to talk to during the dreary bits." Dougal groaned quietly. "Be quicker by bicycle at this rate," he muttered. Dylan was chosen ticket collector. Brian was elected stoker. Mr. McHenry volunteered to ride up front and talk to the train when necessary. All that was needed then was a cook and a buffet attendant. Everyone looked at Florence. "Why are you all looking at me?" she said. "You're a lady," they said, "and so a born provider." Florence sighed. "Oh, all right," she said, "but don't expect too much." They all prepared to get on board, but Dougal made them wait while he went along the train painting big numbers on each carriage. 1, 2, 3, 4. "What are you doing, Dougal?" they asked. Dougal got in the carriage marked 1. "You don't expect me to travel second class, do you? As leader and thinker, I travel first class. Miss Florence as cook and lady travels second. Rabbits traditionally go third. Mr. McHenry travels in the front and Mr. Rusty in the guard's van." "Well, what about pretty brown-eyed me?" said Brian. "For you," said Dougal, "a special class has been created. 4th. All aboard! Here we go! Scotsway!" The train gave a toot and started to move. "You're going without me," wailed Ermyntrude. Everyone urged Ermyntrude to get in before it was too late. "But where shall I get in?" "Anywhere," they said. So Ermyntrude opened a door and got in. "What?" screeched Dougal. "Cows do not travel first." "Too late," they cried. "We're moving." Dougal put his head out of the window. "Stop!" he cried. "Too late!" they shouted. "Toot toot!" went the train. Dougal sighed and sat down. "How long is the journey, dear thing?" said Ermyntrude. "I don't know," said Dougal, "but it's going to seem very, very long." The journey. They left the garden and started the journey to Scotland. It was a good moment, like so many starts. Florence was preparing lunch. She was a bit worried because she didn't have enough fish fingers for 7, but, as she said to herself, they could make up with a lot of mashed potato. Mr. McHenry was listening to Brian singing and asking the train every now and again if she was all right. Mr. Rusty was busy guarding, looking out at every station and hoping they might stop so that he could do a bit of flag waving. Dylan had decided that as no one was paying, there was no need to collect tickets, so he was sleeping instead. Ermyntrude was singing selections from Carmen. Dougal was looking out of the window. By and large, it was a happy trainful, and it seemed as though the journey to Scotland would be completed in record time. At Crewe, while the train filled herself with what she assured everyone was water, Florence served a light luncheon. Afterwards she made tea and lemonade, and they all sat in the buffet car talking about the journey. "I should like to make absolutely certain of the route," said Mr. Rusty, "so that I know if we go wrong or not. Now, where are the main stops?" Dougal consulted a little map on the wall. "It's quite simple," he said. "It's Crewe, we've been there, Carlisle, Glasgow, Auchenshuggle, Tillytoodlem, Glencoe, and Glendougal." "Bristol, Bristol!" shouted a voice outside. "Bristol?" said Dougal faintly. "I warned you," said Mr. Rusty. Dougal rushed to the window and looked out. A porter was walking along the platform. "Excuse me," said Dougal, "is this Bristol?" "Oh, no, me dear," said the porter. "It's Buckner Regis. I'm just shouting Bristol 'cause I likes the name." "Well, there's no need for sarcasm," said Dougal tartly. "And there's no need for soppy questions either," said the porter, going away. Dougal pulled his head back in. Now, there's no need to panic, he said. We mustn't panic. I expect there's a perfectly simple explanation, said Florence. There was. Mr. Rusty came back and explained that the train had taken a little detour to see a friend of hers who was about to retire from the railway service. I don't know, said Dougal irritably. What a way to run a railway. Don't worry, said Florence. Don't worry? Don't worry, said Dougal. Someone's got to worry. It would be a fine thing if no one worried, wouldn't it? Well, worrying won't start the train, said Florence. There was a jerk, and the train started. Dougal looked at Florence. When's tea? He said. I'll make it now, sighed Florence. The train went on while they all had tea. They discussed how long it might take to get to Scotland now that they had detoured to Bristol. Dougal and Mr. Rusty were a bit pessimistic, but, as Florence said, the train was going very fast and they weren't likely to go out of their way again. I wish I could believe that, said Dougal gloomily. She's probably got a friend with flu at Aberystwyth. There was a jerk and a crash. What on earth's happening? Said Florence. The train jerked and rolled and bumped. What's happening? Shrieked Dougal. They bumped and finally stopped. There was a noise, muffled and distant, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Hurroof! It sounded like. We must have hit something, said Florence. Hurroof! Went the noise again. I shall go and investigate, said Mr. Rusty. It's my duty. I think we should all go, said Florence firmly. She didn't like the sound of that hurroof. Hurroof! The noise happened again, but this time it seemed a bit nearer. Listen, whispered Dougal. They all listened. Hurroof! I think it's in here, said Florence faintly. Hurroof! It's near you, Dougal, said Florence. What? Screeched Dougal, leaping back. There was Brian, looking a bit squashed and a lot annoyed. Thank you, he said. Too kind. Didn't you hear me shouting, you great woolly thing? Steady, Brian, said Florence. I'll never be steady again, said Brian. I'm a squash snail. He went and sat down in a corner, looking like a snail who had been sat on by a dog. The others, led by Dougal, went to see the train. They were in the middle of a field, and the train looked very disconsolate. I went off the rails, she said faintly. Is everyone all right? They assured her they were and helped her back on, Dougal leading the way and others pushing and grunting. When she was back, Florence went to see her. All right now? She asked. Pointing the right way? Quite the right way, I think, said the train, and she gave a little toot. Everyone got on board, and they started again. I'm squashed, moaned Brian. Then you won't want cake, will you? Said Florence briskly. I might force down a small piece. So they all had some more tea and cake while the train went on. They passed Carlisle safely, then Glasgow. The eternal city, breathed Dougal, looking out. Then Auchenshuggle, then Tillytootlam. Dougal began to get excited. Glencoe, he said. Oh, the beauty of it. He opened the windows. Curse ye, Black Campbells, he shrieked. Dougal, please, said Florence. Sorry, said Dougal. I was overcome. The train slowed. She gave a little toot. Dougal rushed to the window again. We've arrived, he shouted. We've arrived. Oh, I'm so happy. I'm squashed, said Brian. Oh, be quiet, they all shouted, rushing to the windows and looking out. The train was pulling into a small station. All around was snow, and the big hills were covered in pine trees, all with snow on them like thousands of Christmas trees. The train stopped with a hiss. Everyone was quiet. Then from the far end of the platform came a sound, a musical sound. "The pipes," whispered Dougal. "Oh, the pipes. I may cry." They all got out and stood on the platform. Coming towards them, wearing a kilt and a large plaid bonnet, and playing a set of bagpipes, was a small black figure. "Uncle Hamish," breathed Dougal. Scotland. Uncle Hamish advanced on them, playing the pipes louder and louder, until finally, just as he arrived, he stopped playing them and there was silence. He fixed them all with glittering eyes. "Where's wee Dougie?" "Wee Dougie's here," said Brian, pushing Dougal forward with his nose. Uncle Hamish looked at Dougal. "You're late, you'll get no tea. And put your tabby on straight. You look like Harry Lauder's mother. Come!" And he put the bag of his bagpipes under his arm, blew powerfully, went quite red in the face, and stumped away down the platform, the pipes wailing. Dougal looked at the others. "He's all right, really," he said, laughing nervously. "It's just his way." "I think we'd better go before Uncle Hamish gets cross," said Florence, and they all followed Dougal down the platform. Uncle Hamish was waiting beside a huge black open car. Get in," he said, and they all got in. "You'd better sit beside me, lassie," he said to Florence. Florence sat in the front seat, while Uncle Hamish covered her right up to the chin with a tartan rug. "Everyone ready?" he asked. They were. Uncle Hamish started the engine, put the car into gear, looked round at Florence, gave a huge wink, and they were off. Florence sat back. "It's going to be all right," she thought. They drove away from the station and down a little lane onto the main road. It was getting dark, and a light snow began to fall. "Is it far?" asked Florence. "Oh, just a step, 60 miles. And he gave Florence another huge wink. "We'll be frozen solid," said Dougal. "If you'd rather walk, you can," said Uncle Hamish, turning round and glittering at Dougal. "Uncle, please look where you're going." Uncle Hamish turned back and started down the road. "No one would be foolish enough to get in my way," he said. "Besides, we're there." 60 miles already," said Ermyntrude. "My little joke," boomed Uncle Hamish. "Ha, ha, ha!" He turned and looked at them. "Ha, ha, ha!" they said nervously. The car pulled up in front of a huge grey turreted house, and they all got out clutching their luggage. "Angus, where are you lopsided lump of rubbish?" The great front door creaked open, and out of it came a huge Highland bull. "Ah, hush your wisht." "Dinna hush your wisht to me," shouted Uncle Hamish. "Ah, didna shout at me, you wee black bannock." "Get my friends inside," screeched Uncle Hamish. "Why, are they all helpless?" boomed Angus. "I think we'd better go in," whispered Florence, and she went up the front steps, followed by the others. Ermyntrude was last. She passed Angus. "Hello." Angus stopped glowering at Uncle Hamish and looked at Ermyntrude. "Ah, let me carry your hay for you, my dear." "Too kind," murmured Ermyntrude. They all stood in the great hall. "You'll find your rooms marked clearly," said Uncle Hamish. "But first I expect you'd like a little something." "Well, it has been a long day," said Florence. "You poor wee creatures," said Uncle Hamish. "Angus, open the door." There, in a huge dining room, with another huge fire burning more huge logs, was a huge table laid with a huge meal. There were scones and potatoes and pies and cakes and carrots and lettuce and ice cream and big pots of tea. "Better get to it," said Uncle Hamish, before it gets spoiled. So they all sat down to one of the best meals they'd ever had in their lives, and afterwards they were ready for bed. Next morning, Florence woke up early. The frost had made patterns on her window, and from outside came the sound of bagpipes. She went across to the window, rubbed a little hole to see through, and looked out. There was Uncle Hamish walking up and down in the snow, playing his pipes. Goodness, he must be cold, thought Florence. There was a great booming, clanging noise outside the door. "Breakfast!" bellowed Angus, banging his way down the stairs. And they all went down to breakfast. Uncle Hamish came in and sat at the head of the table. "After you've eaten, I want you all changed into civilized apparel, and that means the kilt. Which tartan do you wear?" He looked at them fiercely. "What about you?" he said to Brian. "McDougal," he squeaked. "What else?" "You'll go far," said Uncle Hamish. He looked around. "You'll all have to wear the true tartan. I've got a few in the great cupboard. Put them on." He drank a cup of tea, ate 7 kippers in quick succession, and stumped out. After breakfast, they all dressed themselves in the true tartan. Brian had a little difficulty because of his lack of waist and legs, and they finally assembled in the great hall and waited for anything that might happen. Uncle Hamish came in. Behind him was Angus with a bag and a hamper. "All set, then?" said Uncle Hamish. For what, Uncle Hamish?" said Dougal. "Well, it's Tuesday, and on Tuesdays, rain or shine, snow or sleet, sun or typhoon, we hunt the haggis." Will we be back for lunch?" said Dougal. Uncle Hamish glittered. "Can you think of nothing but your tum, laddie?" Mr. McHenry asked if it would be all right for him to be excused the haggis hunt. He would prefer to look round the gardens. Mr. Rusty said that would suit him better too. "Oh, please yourselves. Come, we're away." "Follow me, dear," whispered Angus to Ermyntrude. "What are you whispering about, you great lummock?" "Ah, hist, can I not whisper now?" Uncle Hamish glowered, and they set off on the haggis hunt. Outside, Uncle Hamish stood by a large open cart. "Come away, all!" and they all got into the cart. "Big John!" shouted Uncle Hamish. "I'll trouble you to break into a trot." The horse looked over his shoulder. "That'll be the day," he drawled. The cart moved slowly along the road through the snow. Florence in the front with Uncle Hamish, Brian, Dougal and Dillon in the middle, and Angus and Ermyntrude sitting on the picnic basket at the back, giggling a lot. They turned off the road through a gate marked "No Trespassers, No Campbells." "Why does it say no Campbells, Uncle Hamish?" asked Florence. "Because they are black-hearted, fierce and untrustworthy." "Oh," said Florence. They went along a lane through dark pines until they'd reached the end of the trees. "We start here. You'll come with me, lassie," Uncle Hamish said to Florence. "And you come with me, lassie," said Angus to Ermyntrude. "We'll go 3 ways and meet back here for lunch," said Uncle Hamish, and he set off with Florence at a brisk trot. Angus and Ermyntrude went another way, not quite so briskly, and Brian looked at Dougal again. "Have you even the remotest idea what to do?" he asked brightly. "No, I haven't." Big John looked over his nosebag. "You need to creep up and surround them. You can't miss them. They're round and fat and they go wee a lot." "I've gone off the whole idea," said Dougal. "But Uncle Hamish will expect me to catch one, I suppose." "Wee!" said Brian, going down a little hill. "Take cover!" screeched Dougal, going head first into a drift. Brian came back. "What are you doing in there?" "I heard one. It went wee." "Oh, sorry, that was me." They went on. Suddenly, "Wee, wee," they heard. "Was that you?" whispered Dougal. "No," whispered Brian. Dougal went whiter than snow. "It's a haggis," he said faintly. "And it's coming this way," said Brian. "Wee, wee, wee!" A small, round tartan object hurtled over their heads and landed in a flurry of snow a few feet away. The haggis looked at them with two piercing black eyes. "You're supposed to creep up and surround me. I heard you coming 2 miles away." "Well, we've never done it before," said Brian. "Sir, have we caught you?" "You have not, but you're welcome to try. Are you ready?" They said they were. "Away we go then," said the haggis, and it shot straight up in the air with a whee and disappeared like a bullet in the direction of Norway. Dougal sat down. "This is hopeless. It's about 100 miles away by now, and I'm cold." "Well, we don't want to be thought failures, though, do we?" said Brian. "Why not?" said Dougal. Brian climbed up a little hill and slid down again. "I got a marvellous idea. We'll make one." "We'll what?" "Make a haggis," said Brian, "and pretend we crept up on it and surrounded it and captured it. Get your coat off." "Only under protest," said Dougal with dignity, and he took his coat off and gave it to Brian. Brian spread it on the ground and pushed snow into it. It looked just like a haggis except for the eyes. What about the eyes? Brian burrowed into the snow until he cleared a little patch. "We'll use mud," he said. "Sit down here." "Why?" said Dougal. "The ground's frozen. We'll have to warm it." Dougal sat down. The things I do. Meanwhile, back at the cart, the others had returned from the haggis hunt empty-handed. "Didn't catch many, did we?" said Florence brightly. "Nay," said Uncle Hamish gloomily. "Do you usually catch a lot?" "Nay." There was a shout. Dougal and Brian appeared on the brow of the hill, holding something up. "Oh, I think they've caught one," breathed Florence. "How exciting!" "Aye," said Uncle Hamish, not appearing to be too pleased. Dougal and Brian arrived breathless. Uncle Hamish inspected the haggis Brian and Dougal had brought. "Aye," he said, "a good specimen. We'll hang it in the hall over the great fire. Aye." Dougal went pale and choked on a sandwich. "Over the great fire," said Brian. Uncle Hamish," said Dougal, "shouldn't we just let it go, perhaps?" "Let it go?" shouted Uncle Hamish. "My first haggis?" "We caught it," squeaked Brian. "On my land and on the wall over the fire it shall go." They packed up the picnic and all got into the cart, Uncle Hamish putting the haggis under his seat. Dougal and Brian sat nervously together while the cart jolted along. "Oh, fine mess you've got me into," muttered Dougal. "I did my best," murmured Brian. They jogged on. Suddenly Brian nudged Dougal. "Look," he whispered. A trickle of water was running along the bottom of the cart. It was the haggis melting rapidly. A ball of squashy snow tumbled slowly off the back. Dougal put his wet coat back on and waited apprehensively as they jogged along. When they got back, it was getting dark. Uncle Hamish got down and reached under the seat. He fumbled and felt. "It's gone!" he thundered. "Ah, well, they're cunning wee beasties. Come, we'll have some tea." "I see you got your coat back, Dougal," whispered Florence significantly. "Don't be rotten," said Dougal. and they all went in to tea. Tobogganing. At breakfast next morning, no mention was made of the haggis hunt. Instead, Uncle Hamish suggested they might like to amuse themselves, as he was going to be busy. "If we had any sense, we could think of something," said Brian. "All right, clever breeks," said Dougal. "You think of something." "I have," said Brian. They waited. Brian buttered a piece of toast. "Well, tell us then," said Dougal furiously. "Plead with me," said Brian. "Perhaps if you could tell us, Brian," said Florence. "Tin trays." "Tin trays," said Dougal. "Tin trays," said Brian. "They make good toboggans." "Brian, you are clever," said Florence. "Anyone could have thought of that," said Dougal. "Then why didn't you?" "My mind was on higher things." "We'll go on a search," said Florence, "and meet in the hall in 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, in the hall, they were all assembled again. Brian had a tin tray marked Primrose Tea Rooms, scones for a penny. Dougal also had a tray. It was long and thin and covered with a picture of Skelmerley in autumn. Florence had found a large biscuit tin just big enough to sit in, and Dylan had the lid. Ermyntrude came in with a tin lid about 10 centimetres across. "I don't think it will hold me," she said sadly. "I don't think a barren door would hold you," giggled Dougal. Outside, Big John was leaning against the wall. "Hello, Big John," said Florence. "Hi," said Big John. "Going someplace?" "Tobogganing." "I reckon Ben Bumpy would be the best." "What's Ben Bumpy?" said Florence. "A mountain, about half a mile as a crow flies. Course, if I had a mind, I could take you." "We'd be grateful for a lift, Big John," said Florence. "Hitch up, then," said Big John, and as he moved away from the wall, they saw he had attached to his harness a long rope. "An animated ski lift," said Dougal. "Now I've seen everything." They sat on their various trays, stood on their various skis, caught hold of the rope, and Big John started off, pulling them along like a giant tail straight up Ben Bumpy. They stood at the top and looked down. Brian sat on his tray. "I provided the notion, and I think someone else should provide the first run." "You're absolutely right, Mollusk," said Dougal, and he gave Brian a little push. "Help!" said Brian. "Quite a good ton of speed," said Dougal, and he laughed so much he sat down heavily on his tray. "Help!" "I don't think he meant to do that," said Ermyntrude, watching Dougal disappear. Halfway down the slope, Dougal was catching up with Brian very rapidly. Brian was enjoying himself. "Whee!" he shouted. "Whee!" Dougal slid swiftly on. "Get out of the way!" he screeched. "Steer round me!" shouted Brian. "I can't!" screamed Dougal. Dougal got closer and closer. There was a sharp clang. "Welcome aboard," said Brian. Ahead of them, a large mound of snow loomed up. "We'll go over it," shouted Brian happily. They didn't go over it. They went into it. "Do you think they're all right?" said Florence anxiously as she got on her biscuit tin. "No one else coming?" "Goodbye," they said, giving her a little push. Meanwhile, Dougal and Brian were in an icy cavern, and there was a dark tunnel leading out of it. A long black and white nose appeared, followed by a black and white head and a black and white body. It was a badger. "I see you have a tray with you. Whilst this is not actually a cafeteria, I could provide a cup of tea if you wish." He disappeared down the tunnel. "We've got a right one here," whispered Dougal, and he sat down very suddenly with a shriek as a biscuit tin hit him in the back. "Hello!" said Florence. "I was looking for you." Meanwhile, back on the hill, the others had watched Florence's progress with interest. "The girls disappeared too," said Ermentrude. "I think this calls for a search party." So on 2 skis and a biscuit tin, they set out bravely. Meanwhile, back in the Badger's hallway, Florence and Brian and Dougal were drinking tea. There was a flurry of snow, and Ermentrude's head appeared. "I'll just get another cup," said the Badger, and he went. In quick succession, Mr. Rusty, Mr. McHenry, and Dillon arrived in the icy hall. The Badger came back. "I hope we're not intruding," said Mr. Rusty. "Intruding?" said the Badger. Intrusion. To enter uninvited, to thrust oneself in forcibly and unwelcome. I suppose, strictly speaking, you have forced yourself in, but as you are welcome, you are not intruding. I hope you will come again." "Thank you," said Florence. "I think we should go now." "Thank you for the tea," they said. Outside, Big John was waiting. "Hello, Big John," said the Badger. "Leg better?" "Depends on what you mean by better." "Well, in the sense that it's not as bad as it was before." "In that case, yes," said Big John. "Good," said the Badger. "Go safely." "Goodbye, Mr. Campbell," said Big John. And they all went home. Golf. One day, Brian and Dougal were looking around in Uncle Hamish's loft. "Hey, look, what's this?" "That's a golf bag," said Dougal thoughtfully. The bag had lots of little labels hanging from the handle. They read them. Hamish MacDougall, Troon, 1923. Hamish MacDougall, Carnoustie, 1931. Hamish MacDougall, Open Champion St. Andrews. Uncle Hamish was in the hall when they went down with the golf clubs. "Why didn't you tell us you were Open Champion?" said Dougal. "I wasn't asked," said Uncle Hamish. "Will you have a game?" squeaked Brian. Uncle Hamish looked the golf clubs over. "Oh, it's been a long time." "Angus!" Angus appeared. "Put out my +4s and my spiky shoes. We're off to the links." Angus roared with laughter. "I gave your +4s to the Women's Rural Jumble Sale 20 years ago, and your spiky shoes to Oxfam." "You'd no right," screeched Uncle Hamish. So Uncle Hamish put on his brogues and they set off for the golf course. "Go into that shop, say I sent you, and ask Willie McNuckle for some clubs to use." Dougal and Brian did so. Mr. McNuckle," said Dougal. "Aye," said Mr. McNuckle. He was a little man with a huge red beard. We want to borrow some clubs," said Dougal. "Uncle Hamish said you'd lend us some." Willie produced a set of clubs. Dougal picked them up and nearly fell over. "They're a bit heavy." So Willie put the clubs on a little trolley, and Dougal and Brian joined Uncle Hamish on the first tee. "Driver," he said to Angus. "Driver?" whispered Brian. "Where's he going?" "It's a golf club," hissed Dougal. Uncle Hamish put a ball on a little peg, then hit the ball with a great crack and strode away after it. "Spoon!" said Uncle Hamish. "Spoon?" said Angus. "Are you mad? Take the cleek." "Will you give me the spoon and stop blethering?" screamed Uncle Hamish. "Good game, isn't it?" said Brian brightly. They caught up. Angus was holding the flag, and Uncle Hamish was looking intently at his ball, which was lying very close to a little hole. "Uncle Hamish," said Dougal. "Whisht!" said Uncle Hamish. "I've a birdie here." "I think it's golfing talk," hissed Dougal. Uncle Hamish finally made up his mind, and with a great indrawing of breath, tapped the ball into the hole. Lucky, muttered Angus. They walked off to another patch of grass. Will you give me my niblick? Said Uncle Hamish. Angus silently gave him a club. Uncle Hamish swished the ball again, gave a look towards the flag, and hit the ball another great click. It sped up very high and came down again on the green. You'd have done better with your mashy niblick, said Angus. Do you think we should go home? Said Brian. But Dougal was determined. Give me a club, he said. Do you want a spoon or a cleek or a mashy or a baffy? Oh, just give me one. Brian rummaged. There's a nice wooden one here. That'll do, said Dougal, taking the club and walking to the tee. Dougal took a swish or two, looked hard at the ball, and aimed a mighty blow at it. The ball shot straight up into the air. Oh dear, said Brian. The ball came down, 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 landed on the green, hit Uncle Hamish's ball, and dropped into the hole. They walked slowly up to the green where Uncle Hamish and Angus were waiting. Sorry, said Dougal. You should be, said Uncle Hamish. Well, we'll see how you fare on the next. A long hole, this. Where is the hole? Said Dougal. Uncle Hamish pointed. Away in the distance, just visible, fluttered a little flag. Is there a bus? Said Brian. Driver, said Uncle Hamish, and Angus gave him a club. Dougal stepped up to the tee. Driver, he said, and Brian handed him a club. That'll do, said Dougal nonchalantly. They set off towards where the two balls were lying. Dougal turned to Brian. Spoon. Spoon? Said Brian. That's never a spoon shot. Take your mashy tatty. Dougal aimed and swung. The ball stayed where it was, but the club went sideways like a bullet, hit a tree with a sharp crack, shot backwards towards Dougal, and landed at his feet. He laughed nervously. Just practicing, he said. Dougal hit the ball quickly. It went along the ground like a rabbit and ended up just beside Uncle Hamish's. Uncle Hamish gave his ball a little hit, and it rolled up very close to the hole and stopped. He went over and tapped it in. You need to put the ball in the hole in one more stroke and you win, said Uncle Hamish. Dougal went up to the ball and hit it. It went sideways, hit Angus on a horn, bounced on Brian's shell and into the hole. Come, Angus, said Uncle Hamish slowly, wheel away. When they got back, Florence was pouring tea. May I have a spoon? Said Dougal, screeching with laughter. Try a niblick, said Brian, shrieking. Uncle Hamish came in. They stopped laughing very quickly. And what have you been doing, Uncle Hamish? Said Florence. I'd rather not talk about it, he said, in the present company. Highland Games. Don't you think we've been here rather a long time? Said Florence one day when they were all out for a walk. Everyone agreed that perhaps they should think of going back soon. They told Uncle Hamish when they got back for lunch. We'll, he said. Aye, we'll. Then he got up and left without saying any more. We must get him a present, said Florence thoughtfully. But what? Said Mr. Rusty. They thought. Everything went quiet for a very long time. You know what I think? Said Brian suddenly. Yes, we do, said Dougal. I think he'd like us to feel that we appreciated Scotland, so I think we should give him a Highland Games. He looked round brightly. Do you know, said Dougal, I think you may finally have an idea. So it was decided, and of course it was kept a secret from Uncle Hamish. There's just one little thing, said Mr. Rusty. Yes, they said. What are Highland Games? Angus was asked. Is it the games you're planning? Yes, the games, they said. I can wheel the games. Perhaps you'll be kind enough to explain them to us, they said. Well, they toss the caber, said Angus, and they pitch the hammer, and they bend the bawbee, and they slither the shovel, and they call the yows to the nows sometimes, if they have a mind. He paused reflectively. I was good at that. I shall dance my Highland fling, said Florence, if I can learn it. Mr. McHenry said he would provide floral tributes and decorations, and Mr. Rusty said he would announce the events. The next few days were spent preparing. Dougal asked Big John to provide him with a caber, and Big John said he couldn't get one before the day of the games. Don't worry, said Dougal loftily. I don't need practice. The day of the games arrived. After breakfast, Uncle Hamish was led out to the chosen field and seated in a special chair. Dylan came out and proceeded to open the games by playing so powerfully on the bagpipes that Uncle Hamish was seen to wilt. Florence was next. Mr. Rusty laid down boards, Dylan played the pipes, and Florence gave Uncle Hamish her Highland fling. At the end, Uncle Hamish roared to Florence that it was well done, and would she come and sit by him? Florence did so. What's next? Said Uncle Hamish, and Mr. Rusty announced Ermyntrude. Sword dance, whispered Florence. Oh, aye, whispered Uncle Hamish. Ermyntrude hadn't been able to find any swords, so she laid a toasting fork and an old golf club on the dancing board Florence had used, and she performed her sword dance to great acclaim, especially from Angus. Mr. Rusty announced Dougal. Caber tossing, whispered Florence. Oh, aye, whispered Uncle Hamish. Dougal stepped into the middle of the arena. Big John, he called, I'll trouble you for the caber. Big John ambled on, pulling after him a tree trunk of prodigious length and girth. Dougal paled. I must be mad, he groaned, and he got his shoulders under the caber and started to heave. Careful, Dougal, said Florence. Now she tells me, gritted Dougal, doing little runs backwards and forwards with the caber pointing straight up. The caber tilted. Everyone gasped. The caber tilted more, and Dougal set off at a run down the field. Throw it, they shouted. I can't, screeched Dougal. He was gathering more speed and finally disappeared through a hole in the wall at the end of the field. There was a faint crash from the distance, and with a loud squawk, Dougal flew back over into the field and landed in the middle with a bump. Are you all right, Dougal? Called Florence anxiously. Dougal got up and put his kilt straight. I have just run 14 miles holding a tree. I have hit a rock and been flung back like a daub of mud into the middle of the field. Of course I am not all right. Time for Brian's surprise, they all shouted. Mr. Rusty called for silence. Brian went to the middle of the field, bowed right, left and centre, and let out a piercing whistle. There was a rushing of wings, and hundreds of pigeons flew low over the field, circled and went high into the sky. The air filled with the sound of 1,000 pipers, and with a ping and a bong, a table appeared covered with a huge tea with a vast cake in the shape of a letter H. Brian, breathed Florence, what a surprise! How did you do it? Brian smiled modestly. I had a little help, he said, and there was Zebedee bonging around the middle of the field, laughing like anything. The next morning, after they had all packed and had a last look round, The train was found fast asleep in a siding, and everyone loaded in. Florence looked at the hills and the trees. "It's time to go," she said sadly. "I may cry," said Brian. "Don't be so soft," said Dougal, sniffing. Uncle Hamish blew up his bagpipes and started to play a long, sad tune. "I shall cry," said Brian. "Got a hanky?" said Dougal. It was time to go. So they went.